to go back to the Catholic thing, he's with the critic at lunch, and the critic says of the film's treatment of the Catholic Church, you set out to denounce, but you end up an accomplice, which is kind of interesting. So that's an acknowledgement that despite the fact that the church is portrayed as this thing that's kind of terrifying to Guido and that makes him feel guilt and shame after he, gets in trouble, he commits this sin of lust. That's a immediate acknowledgement that the film doesn't have a completely hostile relationship to Catholicism. That's despite the fact that in his kind of dream sequence where he meets with the cardinal in the mud baths, the cardinal only is able to offer these kind of like seemingly unhelpful Latin sayings. He repeats, "There is no salvation outside the church," like in 3 different ways, essentially. Yeah. I don't know that what we're supposed to make of that exactly, but it's interesting that he kind of makes a point of saying, well, this film, even by depicting the memory with Saragina and all of its kind of unhappiness, he's relating this ambivalent relationship with the church, because yes, it is what's making him feel shame, but maybe it's also that it still has this power with him. And also the fact that the scene with Saragina itself is inherently kind of grotesque. So the response from the clergy is, in some sense, kind of commensurate with the offense that we've seen him commit.
Commensurate in the sense that it's also somewhat grotesque. I mean, that's kind of how I read it. That their response is maybe overblown to what actually happened. I mean, all he did was dance with somebody on the beach, and they're acting as if he's sort of, what have you, right?
Right,
that went about as badly as it could go. That it was like the scene from, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where Stephen Dedalus sleeps with a prostitute when he's like 14, right? Which again is taken possibly from James's own biography, right? Speaking of another story that has these kinds of tensions in it, right?
Sure.
So they seem to overblow it in their response, if that makes sense. There's his mother crying again, saying how ashamed she is.
But of course, that's also his memory. That's the weight.
Right.
Because she's standing by a big portrait of like, who is that? Dominic Savio or something. Yeah. Who's kind of like this icon of,
youthful purity.
Yeah. Right. And in fact, that whole memory sequence, the way that it's sort of staged on these like sharp, with the blocking, there's like these sharp angles and walking forwards and backwards. It gives the impression of, there's repetition too. It gives the impression of like a repeated memory, where there's something that you've played through in your mind so many times, you can play it through like clockwork. That whole thing unfolds like clockwork. So that was the effect that it had on me as a viewer, was that, oh, okay, this is a memory that weighs heavily on him. This was a very affecting moment. And I get that, that's no denunciation of the church, to have had like a really, like a moment when you felt really ashamed, and were made to feel very ashamed. But yeah, like I suppose that this is the best place to end up with this conversation is to talk about the church and the religious themes in this film, because they're definitely very present, and strongly felt throughout. And this is also, on the Vatican's list of films. And so I think that this has to be something that the people drafting this list, engaged with in deciding to include this film on the list. But Thomas, you mentioned this scene with the cardinal, where he goes to have an audience with the cardinal, and we only get one line from Guido. He says, "I'm so unhappy." And the cardinal responds, "What makes you think that you're supposed to be happy?" like this isn't what you're made for. And then he goes into the thing from Origin and the 3 different ways of saying outside of the church there is no salvation. And it's super solemn. It's like spoken like a pronouncement, like a sentence. But it's also dispassionate. It's very kind of cold and just like logical, like harsh in its logic, in its finality. But it's also not spoken in anger or in rejection. At least it doesn't seem that way.
But it also comes off like a non-Catholic's or somebody who was raised in Catholic school and then left, their perception of what the Catholic Church is, which is this, like the repeating of these kind of like stock phrases. It almost sounds like these like little bits and snippets.
Yeah, but these are the bits that get drilled into his
that's what
mind.
I'm saying.
These are the thorns.
These things that he
stuck.
remembers from.
Yeah, well, I think that he acknowledges that he wants something from the church, that he needs something from the church, from this cardinal. He wants to meet with the cardinal before his producer even sets up the meeting. When he runs into the cardinal in the elevator, Guido, he is already kind of taken with them in a similar way to how he gets taken with the beautiful women that he sees around him. Right. He gets off the elevator and he kind of watches them as they walk away.
Yeah, but you can also feel his like trepidation and like
but he's afraid of women too. Like his cavalier attitude toward women is just a thin guise, shielding like his deep terror of being rejected by women. So I think there's an analogy here. The church is his mother after all. But like I think that he wants to go to the cardinal for guidance. He's expecting some kind of truth, but he's frustrated by what he knows. I think that this is the sort of frustrating, reality that anybody raised in the church just can't get away from, is that outside of the church, there is no salvation. Now, I know that needs to be
you
like,
don't even need, just leave it.
But what I mean is that that I don't think we're viewing this moment right through the eyes of Vatican II or through the eyes of people outside of the church. We're viewing this moment through the eyes of Guido, raised in the church, who's rejected it, who's running away from it in the same way that he's running away from his wife, that he's running away from himself and from his work, right? And that he stubs his toe against this. He cannot go back to the church and just take, like what he needs to continue to live his life.
Which is what a lot of raised Catholic artists
want to do.
I see that happening a lot today.
Right. Yeah, I'll just go back and I'll just like take what I want and then continue on my merry, like selfish little way. No, he comes and he just runs into this stumbling block. There is nothing for you outside of this church. And I think that it's a kind of, it's frustrating him in the same way that Claudia frustrates him later in that scene we were talking about where, she says what he doesn't want to hear.
She says it, 3 times.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And so I think that, if maybe even if Fellini himself doesn't recognize this, he at least intuits it. He dramatizes it,